What if we could know exactly how generative AI will play out? That's not possible, of course, but we can talk to people who've analyzed past trends. My guest today is Julie Osk, who's an expert on mobile and its rise. She wrote a book about 10 years ago and has even looked at things like Wi-Fi and how that spread. My name's Andrew Hogan. I'm head of insights at Figma, and this is FigBrew.
So my history in tech starts when I was a student at MIT. Can you see this without too much glare? I wanted to pull out one of the recent devices I own, which is the R1 Rabbit. We know each other from working together at Forrester. One of the first nationwide rollouts of Wi-Fi was at McDonald's that shows a bunch of super fun things while I was there.
That is a history. And I mean, it's a perfect segue. You wrote a book on mobile.
I did.
So 10 years ago, the mobile mind shift with some other folks.
Mhm.
And I need to know from you,
Yes.
do I need glasses? Do I need a ring? Do I need a personal projector? Do I need a pendant? Do I need, I don't know what else. Like for Gen AI, which of the devices do I need to have?
Wow. Well, first of all, Andrew, I don't think consumers want Gen AI. Like consumers aren't going to go onto like bestbuy.com and say, I want to buy Gen AI first.
Okay.
So let's
Okay.
not there, right? That's not, I can't go on to amazon.com. Let's broaden out and say type in Gen AI or Gen AI plus device because I want to buy Gen AI. Consumers don't buy technology. There are things, right? So let's park the smartphone for a section because the smartphone, like it is
I
the
did
it
I did
device.
intentionally leave that out. Like,
Right. But the
yeah,
smartphone
yeah.
is the it device because there is so much utility and so much, it's got entertainment, it's education. There are very few of us who can live without a smartphone over a long period of time. Yeah, I can go on vacation and turn it off for 7 or 10 days, but you get what I mean. Even then, I'm taking photographs with it. But there is no other it device. But when you think about why consumers buy devices, it's usually because they need something or have some kind of an outcome in mind. So if I want to be more conscientious about the energy usage in my home, I may buy a connected thermostat, something like that. If I want to sleep right, if you go around and you talk to people who own the Aura Ring about why they have it, why they buy it, more often than not, they're trying to improve their sleep. So they're gathering data. So even if you take into account something like a headset or the Apple Vision Pro, which has been on the market for a number of months now, that's a phenomenal experience for media consumption, but it doesn't
Mhm.
fall into the category yet of have to have or need to have. If they didn't cost $3,500, I would own one because it's a magical experience. But there are few things, if anything, in the need category other than the smartphone, unless I have a very specific outcome or goal in mind.
So people are looking for something. Those devices all do some parts of that thing, maybe slightly better, but you're not necessarily thinking that that's sort of like, Andrew, you should go buy those things at this sort of moment right now.
No, yeah, because the other thing I would tell you about consumers, once you get past the smartphone, they will experiment with a few $100s. That's why you see so many like Fitbits or watches or R1s that are purchased and discarded.
So there's a threshold that they
Yes.
sort of, yeah. And obviously the smartphone has like rocketed out of that, which of course is part of why we're talking today, right after WWDC, and some of Apple's announcements. Apple built a lot of new AI things into what it offers. And broadly at Figma, we've been looking at this coming wave of AI and how AI will just be embedded. You'll expect it to be in everything,
Mhm.
and AI itself won't really be some sort of like
All right, so let me
selling point.
challenge you on that a little bit because AI
Okay.
has been around, like AI has been an idea for as long as I've been alive. And AI, if we just want to call it like the magical fairy dust, has been in our devices for a long time. And it'll be interesting to see if consumers react to the branding of devices of having AI or being powered by Gen AI or capable of delivering Gen AI experiences. But what I think you go back to is companies like Apple and Google and Samsung and the others have embedded AI in their devices and their experiences for years and years now to make what I would call these small incremental or evolutionary improvements and experiences year in and year out. They're not really the kind of things that wow consumers when they first see them. But if AI weren't embedded in the experiences, they'd be terrible. So it's one of those things, I can't live without it, really, or I can't really have a good experience without it. And I also can't really pinpoint what it's doing.
Yeah, it was fascinating to watch Apple solve some of the app challenges. There are so many apps by starting to surface the ones that you care about most
Mhm.
in like different places to more easily. And, that's predictive algorithms.
And sometimes it's not always that hard. If you think about how spell check works, it's doing a lookup.
Yeah.
How often have you typed in a name or a word that's foreign and the dictionary says, that's not a word. It doesn't take it
Yeah.
into context of the full sentence, but no, that's not a word. It replaces with something you completely didn't intend.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it also gets back to, consumers want correct spelling, they want correct grammar, they want this, they want that. How it happens, don't
Yeah.
really care so much.
It's interesting because when we talked to Zan Galani at Duolingo, he said something similar about their experience building AI, products and features. And it's actually distinctly different from sort of the mindset of the enterprise worker,
Mhm.
like a knowledge worker in an office, where the knowledge worker is actually pretty tired of having AI shoved into everything. We've been calling it AI feature fatigue. And
Yes.
Zan said something similar of like, they don't even like think of it. There's no fatigue because they're just not even, it's not even registering for most consumers.
Right. No, I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, Andrew, it goes a little bit too, because, we're going to talk about some of the analogies to mobile and how Gen AI likely will be as game changing as mobile is. And I think one of the things that Apple recognizes is that Gen AI isn't just about a conversational interface. It's not just about accelerating the rollout of chatbots or the use cases of chatbots. That's what we can see and is very easy for us to see now. And yes, there's a lot of things that are going to be made easier by having a conversational interface, but it's an and, it's not an or. And designers really need to take that into account also. And if they're thinking about conversational interfaces as one of the implementations of this technology, it's part of their portfolio, it's part of the experience, it's not the experience in a lot of cases.
So I think one thing that's worth sort of talking about there is to me, having, seen mobile, not from the same vantage point that you
Mhm.
did, this looks a lot like it, where people are talking about it. It's coming, generative AI is coming. It's going to change a bunch of things. Mobile is coming. It's going to change everything. We're going to send people text messages and they're going to be able to do stuff through SMS. And then they're going to,
Mhm.
and like somehow totally did not understand that we'd end up at Uber,
Yes.
especially not in 2008, except that it took years of work. Is that like an
Yes.
accurate way of thinking about like what did you see when mobile was on the rise?
So I would tell you a few things. So one, I'll give credit to our former colleague James McQuivey for saying when new technology comes along, the first and obvious thing that people do is do old things in new ways. And then things get really exciting when we start doing new things. And so when these generational technologies like computers and the internet and mobile and Gen AI come around, what you see is people doing, again, I think, old things in new ways, right? So there's a lot of focus on chat and chatbot and conversational interfaces. And I think like maybe it's not 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to look back and be like, why were we so stuck on that? I mean, really, like, why did we think that was such a big deal, or why did everybody need that so much? So if I go back to the research that I did in mobile, right? So I started in mobile just before the year 2000. And I think my story. I got the opportunity. I used a mobile phone in the late 90s. I was living and working in Germany, and I was like, I'm just going to do this thing. And I quit my job, threw all my stuff into my car. I was living in Cleveland, Ohio at the time, and drove out to California and started looking for a job in mobile, whatever it is that meant. And then about 10 years later, I had the opportunity to do some research that I broadly called the future of mobile as context. And we started talking about the fact that because it was this always on connected device, it was a personal device, it had my location, it had all these sensors, it had my behavior, it knew so many things that I was doing, that ultimately it would first use that context to make experiences simpler for me, to make them more efficient because it knew my location. or it knew where I was or what I was doing or that I was driving, whatever it may be. And then ultimately, this context would be used to become like a virtual assistant or a virtual agent. So when I wrote that research 12, 13, 15 years ago, we thought that was sitting right around. I thought I'll go on that. I thought that was sitting like 5 years out, 10 years out. And then I saw what Apple announced today, June 10th, 2024, for those who watch this podcast later. And I was like, whoa, wait a second. It's starting. Not like it's happened,
So
but it's starting. We're starting to see the potential now of what we thought we started talking about what would happen 15 years ago.
you actually don't, I give the example of like Uber,
Yeah.
and you're like, Uber's not even what I mean. I mean like something way more, way farther beyond that, way, way more personal.
So, yes, and I think there's a progression, right? When we talk about this, Andrew, in the context of consumers, we talk about emerging technologies and how they'll fundamentally change experiences, change products, and change business models. And Uber, what really had an impact about Uber was that they changed the business model and they fundamentally changed the product, because now I could have the taxi come to me. I could track it. Do you remember that part of it? And then I don't know if you ever used Uber early on, but there was a lot of surge pricing. So they
Yeah.
also changed the business model based on supply and demand. So Uber is always one of those examples that we throw out of mobile enabled a completely new product category and a completely new business model. In contrast, one of the other examples I always love about mobile is the story of how USAA came up with the idea of allowing military members serving abroad to take a photograph of a check to deposit it in their bank account, and what a boon to their business that was. I mean, they got like billions more in deposits as a result of that. That's an example of fundamentally changing an experience with new capabilities, but they didn't change the product necessarily or change their business model, but they fundamentally changed an experience, and it was so powerful. Changing experience, a product, and a business model, all of them can be incredibly powerful. But I think what you're digging for here is a little bit is, the Ubers of the mobile experience.
Yeah, what's been called the app layer,
Yeah.
which, all the data says has not received the same amount of funding, hasn't generated the same amount of revenue. We have some data that, a third of the people that have shipped something to date, only a third of them are happy. Only a third of them are proud of what they've shipped to date.
You mean of the
From
large language models or the apps?
generative AI products and features, only a third of them are happy, proud of the thing that they've shipped,
Why is
which,
that?
I mean, so
Is
the
it not doing
qualitative AI,
enough, falling short of expectations, giving wrong answers, too expensive, too slow, too poor of quality? I mean, there's a lot of issues with Gen AI, but which, like,
I
have
mean,
you
we're
been able to
we're
dig into that?
experimenting. So what the conversations that we've been having are that people are experimenting, that in some cases they're being told they need to experiment and build with this thing and ship something from the top.
Shiny
Um,
object.
I
Let's go
mean,
build an app. Let's go
in
put something in the metaverse. Let's do something with Gen AI. You know it's bad. You know that's upside down, but keep going.
I do. But it is true that experimentation is like pretty critical to figuring this stuff out. The question is like, what should you ship and to who? And then what process should you use to do that? And the design of these things matters. Obviously, I would say that, but like, the details matter and the problem that you're trying to solve seems to matter. And in the case of generative AI, it seems like it's actually been more put generative AI in things, not what problem can we solve, and then generative AI may be a solution to that.
Yeah, because I think Andrew, it goes back to some of the work that we've done in the past, and one of the pieces of content that you pointed me to, I thought laid this out really well. It was the Sequoia Ascent event, and I like their framework for organizing things that Gen AI can do, which is to create, to analyze, and interact. I may not have that exactly right, but roughly those are the three categories. And if you go back and if you're a designer and you've got a CX team, let's assume it's a CX team that has identified some customer needs and they said, hey, there's some things that we should build. If you're building something that's creating content or analyzing or is an interface, then I think you do ask yourself the question,
Yeah.
is there a role for Gen AI here? But where I think we don't want to be is saying, hey, Gen AI can do these things. Which of these things might be an answer to our customers' problems? Or, or how do we use Gen AI to do one of these things to reduce the friction in the consumer's experience?
Yeah. But I would assume you saw this in the early days of mobile, right? Like where people said, let's do a mobile thing.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I,
People wasted a lot of money. Life insurance companies at the top of the list of money wasted. I could rank order
we could
money
call that
wasted.
it's R&D, Julie. It's R&D.
No, no, it's usually someone. Okay, I'm not even going to tie it down to a function within a company where someone just like, I want an app.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want
Yeah.
Gen AI.
I mean, we've all seen it. You could call it R&D, you could call it experimentation, you know, all of that. One of the other things though that you did also identify, the title of the book, The Mobile Mind Shift.
Mhm.
And I if I'm correct, like that the idea is that people became they started to expect a certain set of experiences and to be able to do a certain kind of thing.
I'd say yes, and right. So when we talk about, right, and I think when designers, right, and help me translate this into the right language for designers, when you're thinking about building something for a consumer, usually you start with an understanding of the consumer. And if you're in the CX world, it may be a persona that helps you empathize with them. There's some pain points or problems or something you've decided that your brand is going to solve. But then you're also understanding the technology profile of what devices do they own, what platforms do they use, what channels and interfaces are they comfortable with. Then you've got clear business objectives. You decide what you want to do, and then is the technology, really the right way to deliver the services that you've described? And so I think consumers always have to be in the mix when it comes to thinking about, what I'm going to build and is anybody going to use it?
One of the things that was so powerful about that when I first read
Mhm.
that book was the idea that expectations shift
Mhm.
and always shift with new capabilities.
Yes. So yeah, so I'd say, so I think there's two parts to that. So on one hand, the title, The Mobile Mind Shift, was about helping people say, hey, the world has completely changed. You need to think very, very differently about what's possible, to your point, what the expectations of consumers are, and how you're going to deliver the product or the services that your company does. Like fundamentally, like, hey, things are really, really different now. And I think that's one part of it. And I think there are also expectations. I mean, it's oh my goodness. Even if I don't know, Andrew, I hate to date myself here, but I bet I'm pretty sure I had a calculator when I was in grade school, and then I got like a calculator and a more advanced calculator. Spreadsheets came out when I was in high school, and then the ability to do, what are the pivot tables came out, right? And these like capabilities have just been advancing and advancing and advancing. Or let me take a more simple example. If I think how when I was a kid and I wanted to watch a movie, I would either have to get the newspaper out of the garbage or wait for like the paper newspaper to come in the afternoon. I have to open it up and like flip, flip, flip to the back page and then look up what movies were playing at what time and what theater. And now, if you, Andrew, suggest to me that we should go see a movie, I expect to be able to click on that message and like to have it pop up the movie, closest theater, available tickets, 2 clicks to buy. If in my case, if I use Apple Pay because I'm on an iPhone, like the unbelievable convenience that we expect today as consumers is at the core of that, right? And it's not always about convenience, but let me pause there and let you probe, but we can continue.
That's sort of what I mean of you identified this thing that happens that has always happened with technology, but was definitely happening with mobile. And I think the question would be, is that same thing going to happen with generative AI? Where like, why would I go, search for an image? Why wouldn't I just generate an image?
Okay, well, there's two things. One, I don't love the idea of using an image as an example, but let's come back to that. But
Okay.
let's just go to the example that's in front of us, okay? And I know I keep dating myself here, but even if you think about like how we found information as a child, I had to go to the library and like use the Dewey Decimal System to find
I learned
information.
it. I
You
learned it.
learned
Not
it.
useful now. Yeah.
Not useful now. And then over time, we got the internet. Google comes along. I don't know if it's like 20-ish, 25 years ago, and we become used to searching. And then we
Yeah.
get used to using Siri or Google Assistant and just using voice to search. But still, consumers don't want to search. Consumers never said, I want search. consumers have always wanted answers or I don't know, a place to buy whatever it is they want to buy, right? So now, even in this little evolution that we've seen in the past 1 to 2 years, I've gone from using one of these search bars to get search results to getting answers to questions. And I think that's a transition that a lot of designers or people can understand. They're trying to do things where I can say, oh, I want to buy a Blue Yeti microphone, and they'll surface that, and there might be one click buying, but you can see, right, we're not quite there yet. Right now, information works, answers to questions work. It doesn't really work for commerce yet to the same degree, but I think that's an example that you can use of convenience, because consumers don't want to search, and I don't want to flip through a bunch of search results. I want answers to questions.
Yeah, there's some outcome, there's some need that they're
Yeah.
trying to. So what you basically laid out is that there's always this long path of sort of like computing becoming, simpler, and then it changing the expectations that people have to the point where some of the people watching this are going to go like, it was before spreadsheets. Andrew learned a Dewey Decimal System. Like
What
that
is that?
is,
There's
I mean,
yellow pages. There were yellow pages. Books they dropped off once a year at your home.
there's an entire set of things that just like learning them became totally
Mhm.
irrelevant. And that kind of interaction, the expectation is now has been set so differently. And so you've laid out that happens over the arc of history with many things,
Mhm.
but it seems like it took a while for it to happen with mobile.
Yeah,
Like
it's taken a long time.
you wrote that the point about context in 2008, and then here we are in 2024, and the context seems like it's going to get used
In
based
the
on
ways that we
Apple.
imagine, with the power that we imagined. Yes.
Is that, do you think that is normal? That sort of like, this thing is going to take 18, 15 years?
Well, I think there's always trade, right? So I don't want to be the one necessarily to predict like the arc of Gen AI, but let's say that there's a number of factors that are in play. And I think it's a good time to talk about that. On one hand, I think one of the things, and I'll bring this up because a lot of tech companies forget, I don't think designers forget this, but I think tech companies forget this, is that there's a human. And consumers have to be comfortable not only using the device or using the application, I have to be comfortable sharing my information. I have to be comfortable with the security. I have to be comfortable with the privacy. Right. We talk about this arc that consumers go through. If I'm aware of what's possible, I adopt it or try it. I use it. I get comfortable. It becomes a preferred way of doing something. So I think the more interesting thing to go out and do would be to talk to consumers and say, we know almost everybody has used search, but have you tried, let's say, Gemini? Do you use Gemini on a regular basis? Are you comfortable with the output that you're getting from Gemini? Do you prefer Gemini to search yet? Or to more accurately give them a number of different like activities. Like, oh, I want an answer to an easy question, a complicated question. I need help. I want to buy something. I want to control the lights in my home. But across a range of activities of different complexities and requiring different amounts of personal information and different amounts of trust, really see where consumers are on that arc, because I think that's one thing that's really important. There's this theory of what's possible, and then there's the reality of not only what consumers can afford, but what they're comfortable doing for reasons that aren't always rational.
So what was the sort of, it was awareness, adoption.
Adoption, usage, comfort, preference on this arc of getting consumers to where they are today. And the thing would be, Andrew, even if you look, I don't think you wear a watch, a smartwatch.
I,
I
I
wear
do
a,
now. I
you do,
do.
you
Yeah.
look at you. Do you use it for payments?
No, no, I don't.
Here's a question,
So
Andrew. Why
somebody
don't
made
you
fun.
use it for payments?
Someone made fun of me the other day, actually, because I didn't use it for payments.
If I were with you, I would have made fun of you 4 years ago for not using it for payments. But that's my thing. There is no easier way to pay for something than your
Yeah.
watch, especially starting around 2019, 20 with contactless payments, COVID, that acceleration of contactless payments. There is no easier way to pay for something.
I,
No easier way. So
I,
tell me, why do you not use payments on your
it's
watch?
it's another thing that I have to learn and think about, and the phone is pretty easy, but I get the point. Yeah. Well, now I'm being shamed into trying it. I guess I'm gonna
Should
do
be.
that.
You should be. I tell all seniors to use it if they have a watch on, because it's a lot more secure than pulling out a purse or a wallet and rifling through a bunch of stuff. Very
Yeah.
disappointing.
Don't love that comparison, but we're going to go with it.
And I think anyway, and you also have to think about what consumers are willing to pay for. And I think that's also, one of the parts of these models. It's, everyone's been really excited about the hyper adoption of these, a chat-based interface to get answers to questions. If consumers were paying, I don't know if all of your designers or the listeners know this, but in a lot of these models, you pay, it's a high variable cost.
Let's
You
talk
pay
about
the
that.
number of
Let's talk about that for a minute.
okay.
Like how, like what, give me a cost comparison. Is it 10 times more expensive for the company? Is it 50 times? What is how should we think about that?
All right, so the cost of using one of these models depends on several factors, as you might imagine. One is the power of the model, which has a lot to do with the complexity of the inputs or the complexity of the problems it can handle. Second is what we call like the latency. How fast are you getting an answer? It's kind of like customer service or sending something through the mail. Do you want it there tomorrow? Or is it okay if it gets there in like 3 to 7 days? And you pay for that immediacy, and you pay for the reliability of that service. And so when you think about these models, for some of the older models, maybe it costs like 1,000th, or 1/10,000th, I can't even say these words, 1/10,000th of a cent per token. And I know tokens is a hard concept. Consumers don't understand tokens, but for the sake of argument today, we can just talk like a word. So you're literally paying some fraction of a penny per word that you put in or image, and then what you get out. And the cost per image or per word varies based on the complex, how good the model is and how fast it moves for you.
But I'm not paying for that today,
You
right?
probably aren't. So if you dig into that during peak times, it might be a little bit slow. You might just be, you talk about convenience.
Well, no,
Plug
no. I
something
mean,
into
so
one of those image models, you're just going to be watching like, oh, it's.
I pay for a subscription today, but I don't pay per token. I don't pay per,
Mhm.
request. I don't pay, except with the music. I use Suno and you have like kind of a tokens model.
Yeah.
But that's right now being held by the companies, the application layer companies are paying for that.
Well, yes, but they're probably paying some kind of flat fee. But when we take this back to the world of the designer, you are going to pay some kind of fee to use the model. And it's probably not going to be per token, right? When you're using this at scale, because that then like the more successful you are, the more expensive it gets. And that's not any fun. But I think what we can safely say is we can't expect many consumers to pay
No,
that
yeah,
variable cost. So we
that makes
can't
sense.
pass on those costs to consumers. All right. And if you're an enterprise, if you're an app developer, if you're a designer, there's an element of designing these experiences that you're going to take into account, where sometimes you're going to use generative AI and you're going to use like the big expensive thing because it's the only tool that can get the job done. But there's going to be some kind of a process where you can be like, well, do we need a model at all? Can we use a small model? Can we use a simple model? Or do we need to go out and use the big expensive thing? And you're going to have like a cascade of options, and you're only going to go do the expensive thing when you need to.
One of the factors that you're outlining that could make this sort of arc, things being built out take longer is the cost,
Mhm.
and the potential for there being, significantly more variable costs than companies are used to dealing with and can't pass to
Possibly.
consumers.
Yep.
Yeah. What are the other things that you would think about there that would sort of slow things, this progression?
Well, I think the other thing we have to take into account is the risk associated with using the tools. Fundamentally, if something's generative, it's less explainable, it's more unpredictable, and we don't know if there's truth on the other end, which is in contrast to deterministic models, which are always do exactly what you expect them to do, or probabilistic models. This is a generative model. Can't explain it, it's expensive to use, it's slow, and it may just be making things up. Right. And so this is where you get to, I think, a couple of categories here. So on one hand, yeah, it's poking fun at the Excel thing. I can use one of these models to help me do some analysis. But if I don't have the background or the intelligence or the ability or the prior experience to know if it looks about right or if it is exactly the right answer, it's a bit risky to use
Mm.
that to get an answer. And then certainly the risk depends on the use case. If it's in banking, if it's in healthcare, if it's in a regulated environment where there's a lot at stake, we can't just pass through guesses. They're likely to be right, but aren't always right. So, things
Yeah.
like that are going to come into taken. You have to take that into account.
So,
If
and
you're
then,
looking up what year the Civil War happened in the United States, I don't know, was it 1960, 1960, 18, I'm sorry, 1860, 62? I mean, give or take, right?
yeah.
But if it, is about moving money or a diagnosis in a healthcare situation or treating someone with a mental illness, it's, you've got to be very, very careful. And so, that's where they talk about human in the loop or, even if you're, somebody who knows what they're doing, even if you talk about, a developer who's using it to write code, somebody's still probably going to skim that and be, yep, that, it looks about right. That's the
They're
output expected.
they are definitely gonna think about it. It's gonna become a building block. So you talked about some of the human factors, just what does it take for people to adopt it? You revealed my embarrassing secret that I don't use my watch to pay for things, despite being squarely in the Apple ecosystem. You talked about some of the technology sort of things that have implications on business models. There's like sort of these risks from industries, and we did see slower adoption, especially in products and services, like building new products and services from
Yeah.
regulated industries.
Yeah. I'll give you a couple more. So today, the last numbers that I read, not my studies, but most of these have been done by universities like Carnegie Mellon and other places, Wharton. Data centers today currently consume about 2% of the electricity in the United States. There was a study done by Hugging Face and Carnegie Mellon where they actually tried to calculate the amount of energy consumed by doing each query, like by, using one of these models. And what stuck with me, and it was an image. I don't want to say which model it was because I don't remember exactly, but it was one of the image creation models where the creation of an image costs the same amount in energy as charging my smartphone or driving 4 miles with my car. And this is probably a more complex image than maybe a marketer may be thinking about of dropping into an email when they're thinking about one-to-one personalization. But if we take this analogy to the extreme, if doing one-to-one marketing to 10 million of your customers is the same as driving 40 million miles in a car in terms of energy consumption, we've got to, right? That's an extreme, right? That's an exaggeration, but it makes you begin to think, is this the right way to be using resources? All right, so the ethical implications is today, right, we're going back and forth and we're like using these things and getting some photos and getting some images. If I can use these tools to learn how to bake a cake, I might also be able to use one of these models to learn how to build a weapon. Right? There's a lot of dark things that you could teach people how to do or explain to people how to do, and we have to decide, is that okay? Is that something we want to do, or is it something we don't want to do? But that's just retrieving information today. Ultimately, this technology is going to evolve into being more assistive, like giving us suggestions, doing things on our behalf, or even agentive. And in order for these, let's call them applications, to work that way, we're going to give them instructions. Hey, I want you to count this, do this, prepare me for the test that I'm about to take. And we're giving it a goal, but are we giving it any guidelines for how to achieve that goal? And so, Andrew, if let's say you were still in school and you wanted to get ahead and you wanted to get an A on your history test, there's so many ways that you could do it. You could be a really diligent student and you could read and learn every day and stay up to date. You could try to steal the test or get the test from someone last year. You could give food poisoning to everyone else in the class so that you were the only one to show up and take that test. Right? There's a lot of ways that you could come out on top in that environment. And you're not, I know most people are not going to be okay with most of those scenarios that I just
Yeah.
laid out. They're
Yeah.
extreme by demonstration. If we're going to have assistants or agents begin to act on our behalf, who's ultimately responsible for what they do? And there may be things that are in my comfort zone that are different than what's in your comfort zone. And how do we create models, or who creates the models, or who puts the guardrails on the models in terms of what they can or will do for us?
The analogy I've heard is the car. And the car does lots of different things. some of which we've decided are okay and some of which we've decided are not.
Mhm.
But it's taken some time to work out what we're okay with and what we're not. And if you go all the way back, at one point you steered with a tiller
Mhm.
before the steering wheel, and there were no like lanes or turn signals or anything like
Mhm.
that. And now we're like, well, maybe we should have some bike lanes. Maybe we should like make it safer for bikes to be on the road with cars.
Yeah, and I think it's always hard to know what scenarios are going to come up. I mean, we both live in the Bay Area, especially during the pandemic. We saw Waymo, Google, and Cruise, I think it's from GM, training their vehicles on our streets. And it's really hard to think of all the scenarios.
So all of that brings us to Apple today. They announced sort of their, newest foray. This one is into generative AI.
Mhm.
We're years after Siri was sort of announced. And what do you make of Apple's announcements today, and what impact they'll have on the sort of consumer tech, consumer hardware world?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. And it's always interesting to see what Apple is going to do because Apple has an installed base of more than 2 billion devices globally. They have one of the most affluent customer bases globally. And they're really, really good at creating consumer experiences. So it's always interesting. And I feel like it's always important to watch what they're doing. So my biggest takeaway from the event is Apple showed us how Gen AI can evolve and improve their experience unless that they can develop brand new or what I would call revolutionary experiences. And I think that was my biggest takeaway. And to give you a few, I think one of the points we think about, it's still really important to have a relationship with the consumer, right? Yes, companies like OpenAI are building relationships with consumers, and they have, I don't know how many paying consumers. Apple has 2 billion paying, or I don't, they have 2 billion in their installed base, and some subset of that they have a payment relationship. I mean, they have a payment relationship with everyone who has an Apple device. People tend to own more than one Apple device, is what I mean. So Apple still has control over a vast population of this world in terms of the experiences that they have. So that's one thing. Apple still has a lot of control because they have that customer base. I think a second thing that we see with Apple is like I said, they're improving the apps, they're improving the experiences. They still have control over what's going on in their devices, right? And I think this is a really important point because one of the, if you're a competitor to Apple, or if you're not a Google, you're not an Apple, you're not a Samsung, right? We've seen a lot of litigation around it's unfair, it's not fair that Apple owns the smartphone and the OS, and they have some native apps because that gives them so much power in terms of what appears on their platform, the economics and whatnot, right? Even though, I think it was in 2022, they paid out more than $1 trillion to app developers, right? There's the potential there for an ecosystem. One of the other things we think about when it comes to consumers, and I think there's 5 points that I called out here that I think are very important. The first one is that personal context matters. It's one thing to go ask the universe, like Google, a question a question, right? And I could go ask the universe, where's the best pizza? And it might come up with some kind of an answer. But I'm going to get a better answer if that tool or that application is who I am, where I live, what I've eaten in the past, what my preferences are for Detroit style, deep dish, thin, meat, vegan, you name it. I'm just going to get a better recommendation. Even if I were to go to one of these models and ask it, hey, what should I snack on? Right? That personal content, that the Apple app is going to be better because it has my personal context. This notion of context, like we talked about, have been following for 10, 20 years now. There
Yeah.
are a few entities outside of Google or Apple that have as much context about me. When Apple launched its first iPhone, it had 16 native apps. Now it has 30. Think for a moment what you do on your smartphone that doesn't involve Apple, because it's TV, it's music, it's health, it's banking, it's payments, it's ID, it's my driver's license, it's my mail, it's my messaging, it's my photos, it's tracking, somebody and where they are in a map. It's a lot of things these days. So that's one. I think the context and the amount of information, and Apple has said, we'll keep it private. It's going to be on your device if at all possible. And if it's not on your device, it's going to be in a private cloud. So they're not going to be training on your data. And I think consumers are going to be sensitive to that, which brings me to my second point is privacy matters, right? We could argue about, how the tech companies have made money on the West Coast, a lot of them by monetizing consumers' data. And we could argue, well, who's gotten more out of that, the tech companies or the consumers? But in this next go around with this next big jump in technology, I think consumers are more tuned in to how their data is being used and what are the benefits they're getting from their data. So those kinds of messages will appeal. We talked about we talked about how consumers don't buy technology, but they want entertainment, they want to lose weight, they want to learn things. And that's through the application layer, which we believe is where more of the value is going to be than in the language models themselves. Fourth thing, generative AI isn't just about a conversational interface. It's one of the many things it does, but it's not always going to be about a conversational interface. And you have kids, Andrew. There's probably been times when you've been trying to explain to your 2-year-old what you want her to do, and they're just like, forget it, I'll do it myself. Sometimes there is no amount of language that is going to help an agent or a third party get done what you need to get done. And then finally, we talked about how consumers are very unlikely to take on variable costs. Things like SMS and use of internet took off when the rates were flat.
So a lot about sort of the control, the distribution, the
value at the app layer.
The value at the
consumers
app
don't buy
layer.
technology, they buy services and experiences and products.
Yeah. And I just can't help but think about like so many of the apps that basically every app I really need, it's on my phone. Every service I really want access to is on my phone.
Mhm.
And one of the things that Apple has said is, it sort of can see the things that you're able to do within those apps and then start to do those things, stitch them together before I know that was part of your analysis of where this all was going to go. That just is fascinating to me because they are one of the few companies, like you said, that can actually do this. And that's what everybody wants.
Yes. And I do not predict, whatever verb you want to use, that consumers are going to use low code tools to stitch together like a sequence of events, right? This is about a brand like Apple understanding enough about me and me trusting them to do that on inferring it and doing it on my behalf.
Yeah.
If I were to say though, like before we wrap up, one of the things like designers should take into account is, Apple's going to have new hardware in the fall. And we'd have to expect that they're going to put some kind of a smaller large language model on the smartphones, right? And that will allow, also everybody to keep data local, secure, private, and also just increase the speed and get rid of this idea of variable costs once I put a model on the phone. That'll happen.
That would then mean predict that the costs will come down. You'll be able to do more. One of my favorite terms is Javon's paradox, which is that when things get cheaper, you find new ways to use them. Mm-hmm. This is maybe a textbook example of that, where things are going to get cheaper. We'll find new ways to use them.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for being on FigBrew.
Thank you.
Till next time.
Thanks, FigBrew.